All right, fantastic. So um, I am going to be recording this session and tomorrow's session so that if any of you have to hop off or can't make it, that's okay. You can always access these recordings later, okay? So just a little intro. Today's training about rain gardens is part of a larger educational program that we're doing called Alabama Watershed Stewards. And I just wanted to give you a little background on that because this workshop and a variety of other workshops are part of that. So Alabama Watershed Stewards is an educational program that we've developed here with Extension Water here in Auburn, but in tandem with Water Watch and the Water Resource Center. And it's a program funded by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management through a 319 grant. So the goal of this whole program is to help, educate citizens across Alabama and get them interested and involved in protecting their own waterways and making a difference locally where they are. So hopefully that's kind of what we're going to learn today and tomorrow and kind of fulfill that watershed stewardship goal. But just to give you a little more background about who I am and who my colleagues are, I'm joined today by Caitlin Sweeney and Naomi Pitts, and they're also part of the Extension Water Program here at Auburn. But we are a team headed up by Dr. Eve Brantley, and our objective at the ACES Water Program is to outreach and education about watershed quality, watershed stewardship. We create educational programs, we do on-the-ground trainings, we install rain gardens, we work with a variety of grant programs, and largely we're here to help, educate and involve citizens across the state in improving water quality. So we're really happy that you're here and being a part of that. All right, so quickly, I know we're getting a lot of people in. So I know some of you guys are putting your names and locations in the chat, which I think is fantastic. So please do that. But I also have a little poll for you that I'd love for you to fill out quickly, just to get an idea of who's here and kind of what you know about this. Can everyone see that poll pop up on their screen? Okay, I'll just give you guys a couple seconds. So if you fill that out really quickly, and if you want to give more information about yourself, feel free to just drop that in the chat so people can see where you're coming from. Let's see. All right, and while you guys are doing that, I will just quickly say that after this training, I'll also be following up with more information about rain gardens, after tomorrow's workshop. But I'll also be providing you some more information about watershed stewards and the upcoming trainings that we have so that you can get involved if you want to learn more about watershed stewardship and ways that you can make a difference. We will try to keep you in the loop about upcoming opportunities. All right, looks like most people have voted. For the few of you who haven't, feel free to do that really quickly. And I'm checking over here in the chat box, and it looks like we've got people from Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia Beach. Wow, fantastic. Well, I'm really happy that everyone has showed up. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll, and hopefully you guys will be able to view it. Yeah, can everyone see that? So it looks like a lot of you all are just interested in learning those practical details about installing rain gardens and learning how to do an attractive job to make sure that people in your community are accepting of those rain gardens. And it seems like we have a range of understanding already. Some people kind of know about rain gardens, and some people are brand new beginners, which is fantastic. And it looks like we have people represented, all across the state and of different backgrounds. So I'm really excited about that. So feel free to look at that, but I'll go ahead and get going. So thanks everyone for being here. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing today, basically day one, we are going to be giving an introduction to rain gardens and stormwater. And we're going to be talking a little bit about site evaluation. How do you select a good site for your rain garden? How do you know if you're selecting a site that would be good for infiltration? And how do we assess the soils to make sure that we're picking a good site? So that's the kind of stuff that we're going to cover today, and provide like a little bit of a bigger picture to why we want to install rain gardens to begin with. And then tomorrow, same time, same place, we're going to be digging into the nitty gritty of how do we actually go about installing, and how do we choose which plants to put in our rain garden. So that will be tomorrow. And all of this, of course, will be recorded so that you can rewatch it if you would like to. Quickly, I will just say, I know that we have a lot of people on, so just to be respectful of everyone's time, if we have questions, please feel free to put that in the chat, and either I or Caitlin or Naomi will try to get to that. We'll also try to leave some room at the end of the session to answer questions. So otherwise, if you guys don't mind, please stay muted so that the audio quality is better for everybody. Like I said, at the end of the training, we will provide you with the recordings, and we'll also give you a link to our rain garden manual, which I have to say is still in draft form and is currently being designed by our ACES Water communications team, but you'll still get that information. We'll also provide you some links to plant nurseries, helpful other resources, just to help you get started kind of doing your own rain garden. We'll also keep you in the loop about some upcoming events. All right. So I know this may be a review for some of you guys, but just to make sure that everybody is on board and kind of understands, like I said, the bigger picture for why we're interested in installing rain gardens, we're going to do a little intro to stormwater. So first of all, what is a rain garden? I think most of us probably know, but just in case. Rain gardens are actually part of a stormwater management system. They can be both aesthetic and functional. You can think of them, simplistically as kind of a depression in the landscape that is designed to help kind of capture and infiltrate stormwater runoff to, get it back into the ground, kind of replicate that natural hydrological cycle in urban areas. So rain gardens are also filled with native vegetation, and they can also be a really good source of habitat for some urban creatures. So they can have multiple benefits. And they can come in a variety of shapes and sizes and aesthetics. I mean, that's largely what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, thinking about how you can fit your rain garden into a practical location that is meeting those stormwater needs, but also can fulfill maybe an aesthetic need as well. So we'll dive into that a little bit more tomorrow, but just, have that in the back of your head that rain gardens don't just come in one shape or size, and we'll talk about how to kind of make these choices as we go along the design process. Okay. So why are we interested in installing rain gardens? Well, I think there's probably a variety of reasons, but they can play a really important role in cleaning stormwater in our watersheds and actually preventing some polluted runoff from entering streams and rivers, which may not seem an obvious thing when we hear the term rain garden, but this can actually be a really helpful best management practice in urban areas, especially when we think about multiple rain gardens being spread out across an urban area. Well, this will make a little more sense in just a second, but one rain garden can make a difference, but especially when we have multiple people like yourselves installing rain gardens, it can compound and make even a bigger difference. Okay, so I haven't introduced some of these terms yet. So some of you, I think, know what a watershed is, but just in case, a watershed is a natural kind of geographic boundary that kind of determines when it rains, where that rainwater is going to flow. So rainwater or watersheds are basically where that I'm trying to multitask here and let people in, but it's where that rainwater will flow to the lowest point in a landscape. And that's often a river, a stream, or a lake. And so in this kind of picture here, you can see how we've outlined the ridges of a a geographic area and how that water is all draining to its common low point. So you could think of watersheds as being kind of like, nested Russian nesting dolls, where you can have smaller watersheds nested within larger watersheds. And often we hear the term river basin, and we can think about multiple watersheds being nested within a river basin. So that's just some background vocabulary to make sure that we all are on the same page. I think my slides are getting ahead of me here, but I think I just gave away my question. How many river basins does Alabama have? Well, we have 16. And again, those watersheds you can have multiple sub-watersheds nested within a river basin. But within those river basins, this is kind of the geographic area where that water, when it rains, is going to flow to its lowest common point. And here, that could be the Coosa River, the Tallapoosa, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully you all know where you are, which river basin you're in. And this can kind of just give you a better idea of how we're all connected through hydrology in some way, because as you can see on that picture on the right, all those rivers are ultimately kind of coming together and draining to the ocean eventually. So, the impacts that we have on our water quality where we are can ultimately affect not only ourselves, but also people downriver of us or in a separate watershed. So hopefully that's getting everybody on board with kind of the larger picture of maybe why why improving stormwater can make a difference. And of course, here in Alabama, we have great water resources and some of the most biodiverse aquatic life in the nation. So that's just to emphasize the importance of trying to make a difference in improving our water quality. All right, so what does that all have to do with rain gardens? Why do we care? Let me just back up and explain a little bit about urbanization and land use and what rain gardens have to do with all that. So we talked about watersheds, and in a watershed that isn't highly urbanized, you're going to have a lot of trees, a lot of vegetation, and a lot of roots to kind of help keep that water in place whenever it rains. But as we become more urbanized, we also have these other impacts. We start to have removal of vegetation, we have soil compaction, making it a little harder for that rainwater to infiltrate back into the ground. We also have more erosion and sedimentation through that urban runoff. And with those impervious surfaces like roads, sidewalks, rooftops, etc., we start to deal with some different kind of stormwater issues. And typically in urban areas, we've dealt with that with conventional stormwater management. And what that means really is typically removing that water from public areas as fast as possible, because we don't want it to be a hazard to our infrastructure, and then condensing and kind of channelizing that water through storm drain systems. So typically we kind of keep stormwater out of sight, out of mind, which may have worked in some way in the kind of from the traditional engineering perspective, but we're learning that actually has a lot of problems, and there are certain steps that we can take to kind of make a difference with that. So again, my slides are not, they're not allowing me to give you guys quizzes here, but I think many of you probably already know this, but when stormwater does fall in an urban area, typically, it doesn't necessarily go anywhere to get treated. It typically gets channelized straight into an outfall pipe into a nearby stream or river. And that can be surprising to a lot of people, because many people think that stormwater is actually being treated before it ends up being put back out into our natural resources. And that often is not the case. So rain gardens can play a role in helping to kind of capture and infiltrate some of those pollutants before they run off into our urban streams. This chart here on the right just gives you an idea of the difference in stormwater kind of management that we see in highly vegetated areas versus urban areas. And in those vegetated areas, you have more of that rainwater going back into the ground, being infiltrated into groundwater, more of it being put back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, through vegetation, and a lot less runoff. Compare that to, highly urban areas that we see here on the right. That water is not able to get back into the ground to be infiltrated because it is running off those impervious surfaces. So ultimately, what that ends up meaning for us is that you can see here on this bottom kind of green line here, when it rains in a non-urbanized area, this is what we might expect to see a little more of. We see, rainwater kind of slowly filtering down those watersheds into those shared streams, rivers, kind of the lowest point in the watershed. And while there may be a kind of a bump in flow, it's not going to be as immediate as what we see here in the red, where there's a lot more runoff arriving a lot faster because that stormwater runoff is being put into those storm drains and channeled straight to our rivers and streams. And that means a big change in kind of urban hydrology as we know it. I'm not sure that this will play for me, but this is just a picture of a urban stream here in Auburn, Alabama. And I'm having some slide difficulties, but to give you the gist of it, it started raining at 7 o'clock in the morning here. And throughout the day, just in a couple hours, this water level rose all the way to this kind of tree, basically above that rock line. And that's just in a series of hours. So think about all that rainwater just being channelized into those rivers and streams very quickly. That has a big impact on those riparian buffers, those kind of riparian areas along the stream bank. As you can see, they've tried to deal with this issue by putting down some riprap and some erosion control matting, but they're up against a difficult problem. And here's an example of kind of maybe the types of urban streams that we often see. You see this highly eroded stream bank here, showing a lot of potential for erosion and sedimentation. And that has to do, this is often because of those kind of changes in urban hydrology and those large kind of flashy flows that are caused by that. And as you can imagine, this is problematic because not only are we getting a lot more pollutants being picked up in that stormwater runoff and running straight to those rivers and streams, we're also getting more sedimentation, a lot more erosion, and of course it's degrading our aquatic habitat. So just to summarize, getting more runoff, a lot less infiltration, more flooding, and less of that base flow, which would be coming typically through that water infiltrating back into the soil and eventually kind of moving down to those shared waterways. Okay, so stormwater, as you can imagine, when it rains on those urban areas, it's picking up pollutants across the landscape. So, think about parking lots, roads, it can pick up metals from rooftops, et cetera, et cetera. All of that can eventually find its way into local streams and rivers. And an easy way to think about types of pollutants and pollutant sources are point source and non-point source pollutants. Point sources, think of it as something that you can actually point to, maybe like a factory pipe, being directed right into a river or stream. That would be maybe a point source of pollution. Non-point source is typically what we're dealing with, however, and that's a little bit more of a difficult problem because that's pollutants that are distributed across the landscape and being picked up in that stormwater runoff. So it's more difficult to deal with, and it can be a big problem. So just some examples of that would be, oil and gas from parking lots, metals, excess fertilizers from our lawns that our plants can't uptake, bacteria from, pet waste, things like that, and sediment, like we saw with those highly eroded stream banks. All of those can be considered non-point source pollutants. Okay, so I'm going to pause here so you guys don't have to listen to me the entire time, and I'm going to turn it over to Naomi, and she's just going to tell you a little bit about some of the best management practices that we can take to address these issues and how rain gardens fit right into that. Let's see.
Hello, everyone.
Hey.
Yeah, hi. All right, Laura's going to be clicking the slides for me, but my name is Naomi. I'm an undergraduate student working for the water program. And as she mentioned, I'll be talking with you guys about best management practices, which are essentially structures and processes used to protect water and soil quality. So what do rain gardens have to do with this? When it comes to rain gardens, one of their primary functions is to improve water quality. So when introduced into urban areas that typically deal with higher levels of pollution, they can have a great benefit. Having a single rain garden in an area might not have the greatest impact, but by incorporating several best management practices and green infrastructure into a landscape, they can work together to solve issues at a larger scale. So these two images show us the difference between infrastructure and how it's traditionally designed and green infrastructure. So if we look to the left immediately in the first image, um, we can see that there are several pollutants coming from this suburban area. There's oil in front of the garage where the car was parked. These likely contain heavy metals along with other harmful chemicals. There's some pet waste in the front yard that someone neglected to clean up. While you may think that this pet waste is harmless, it may harbor nutrients and fecal bacteria that will reduce the quality of the water and cause sickness. Speaking of nutrients, if this person uses fertilizers, the phosphorus and nitrogen may be running off into the stream drain or into the storm drain. And lastly, we see some litter by the bank. Now next, I want us to notice all of the impervious surfaces in this suburban environment. There's the rooftop, the driveway, and the roads. Since all of the pollutants I mentioned before have no way of infiltrating the ground, they will go directly into the storm drain and into the local watershed. Now, if we look to the image at the right, many of these, excuse me, there's, sorry. Now, if we look at the image at the right, many of these pollutants may be present in this area, but now there's a rain garden to help manage some of the runoff. So when it rains, all these pollutants in the area will be carried into the rain garden rather than directly into the storm drain. And by infiltrating the soil, the garden will be filtered, the water in the garden will be filtered to a certain extent. Now we'll go over some definitions regarding best management practices. Um, So what we saw on the right in the previous slide was an example of a best management practice, or BMP for short. The two types of BMPs are low impact development and green infrastructure. They're pretty similar in definition, but there are some slight differences. Low impact development refers to the planning, design, and practices that protect water quality. This is done by implementing plans that preserve the natural environment, having minimal environmental impact, and managing runoff close to the source. As for green infrastructure, these are features meant to mimic natural flow of water in the environment, and they help to manage stormwater. Integrated green infrastructure is an umbrella term with low impact development underneath it. All right. So next, I'll explain why we've been talking so much about stormwater. I want to tell you about the term first flush, which refers to the initial runoff during a storm event. The first inch or so of runoff is what contains most of the pollutants in a storm event. If this water isn't treated by the means of green infrastructure, it can lead to rapid changes in water quality. So capturing and treating this water would take care of treating a majority of the storm's pollutant load.
I'll just interrupt here and say I apologize for these slides, but here on the right, we have Kermit the Frog being attacked by a first flush of pollutants, which you can't see. But anyway, I'll just move on with that. But sorry, Naomi.
All right, here in this slide, we see several other types of LID. So rain gardens are not the only type of green infrastructure that can be used for water management. And I'll go over a few of these examples. So on the far left, we have a grass swale, which can be contrasted with a typical impervious channel, which you may see along the side of the road is normally just filled with concrete. At the top, we have a rain garden, which is located outside of the Ford Dining Hall if you've ever been to Auburn University. It adds to the aesthetic value while also managing runoff in the area. The top right are some interlocking bricks, which are a type of pervious pavement so that when it rains, the water can permeate through. And at the bottom, we have a roadside wetland and a street tree. Much like the rain garden near the dining hall, the street tree functions as a device to filter and reduce runoff while also making the area visually pleasing. Something each of these designs has in common is that it provides a way for water to infiltrate the ground and causes a minimal amount of disruption to the natural environment. Now we can get into the specifics of how a rain garden functions. They help to manage runoff by mimicking how water naturally flows in an environment. This means that they slow the water down, spread it out, and allow it to sink into the ground. This not only helps to filter the water, but also reduces the chance of flooding and erosion. As Laura mentioned earlier, when you have urban environments, there's a higher influx of runoff versus when you have a vegetated environment. Now we can see the parts of a rain garden. This is an example of a standard rain garden. It's made on top of native soil. And first there's a layer of tilled native soil, and this is for drainage purposes. Next, there's a layer of mulch, which will help the soil to retain moisture. This is especially important in the early stages of plant growth when the plants are needing that water to grow. Each of these layers lies within a basin where runoff collects after a storm event. If you'll notice the shape of the basin, some areas near the bottom will hold water longer than areas near the edge, and you should take this into consideration when deciding on plants for your garden, and we'll explain that more later in the presentation. This is another view of the parts of a rain garden that better show the hydrology. So as you can see, the runoff comes into the garden at a certain point and it begins to pond. Once it's there, it may either evaporate, infiltrate the soil below, or overflow if it receives a high volume of water. Rain gardens have many benefits aside from being attractive yard installations. They can be done on your own for a reasonable price without the need for a contractor or landscaper. They'll allow you to take initiative and handle the pollution made by your home. Once installed and filled with native plants, they become a habitat for animals. You can even select certain components to attract specific species to your garden. Like if you want butterflies, you can have certain flowers, and if you put rocks around the edge, that may attract lizards. Can you guys think of any other benefits that you might want to drop in the chat of having a rain garden in your yard? All right. Now we'll go over some frequently asked questions and considerations about rain gardens. The first being, will it attract mosquitoes? So no, your rain garden will not attract mosquitoes. The water does not sit long enough to attract or breed mosquitoes. And if water is sitting in your garden for longer than 12 to 48 hours is not draining sufficiently, you'll have to do some work there. Next, are they expensive? Rain gardens cost the same as a perennial flower garden and require much less maintenance. Many of the tools you'll need you may already have on hand. The most expensive part would just be purchasing your plants. Do they work in the winter? So in the winter, your plants may be dormant, but that does not stop the garden from performing its water management functions. Can you build a garden yourself? You can absolutely build a garden yourself without the use of a landscaper, as I mentioned before. And later in this presentation, we'll show you exactly how to do that. If you're afraid your neighbors will complain, well, hopefully your neighbors will recognize the beauty of having native plants in your yard. But if they seem resistant, a great way to get people on board is education. So consider having a conversation with them about what a rain garden is and why you've chosen to build one. And maybe even you can put a sign out front of your garden so people can walk by and see exactly what it is. And last, how much maintenance will your garden need? Rain gardens don't require much maintenance, especially if you use native plants. Because native plants are well adapted to their surroundings, you won't have to apply fertilizers or pesticides. Just be sure to water them in the early stages of plant development and during any extended dry periods. So now that you hopefully understand the function and benefits of a rain garden, I'll give this back away to Laura so she can go over the steps of designing a rain garden.
Great, thank you, Naomi. That was helpful. Okay, so now that we are all on the same page and we have a kind of, larger view of why we are interested in installing rain gardens, we're going to start getting into the steps. All right, so number one, site selection. How do we know where we should place our rain garden? So we have to be a bit of an investigator. So we need to ask ourselves questions like, where would the best location be? What are the soils in this location? What are our constraints? And what is our natural topography, and where's the water flowing already? So these are some things that we want to go out and consider. I highly suggest that you do an in-person visit first. I mean, ideally, if this is your house or maybe this is somewhere that you work, definitely go visit the site, take some pictures if you want, and start thinking about these things. What is the topography like? When it rains, where's that water? Where's that storm water running off? Where's that water flowing? What are those drainage patterns that you typically see? You also want to start identifying downspouts. If some buildings don't have that, downspouts are basically the little outflow pipes where the gutters from your rooftops are kind of channelizing that water. Those are your downspouts. So identify where those are and where that water is being put out into the landscape, because that's actually a lot of water runoff. And often we want to think about maybe rain gardens kind of capturing some of that runoff from rooftops as well. Also think about those other impervious surfaces like driveways or sidewalks, things like that. Start to notice if there are areas where you get a lot of ponding. That can be an indicator that the soil is not draining very well there. It may also, you might also just be noticing where water tends to flow naturally and where those kind of lower depressive parts in the landscape are. Just start kind of paying attention and maybe making some mental maps or actual physical maps of potentially good sites for a rain garden, keeping in mind everything that we kind of just went over, that we do want to be intercepting that stormwater runoff. So, here at the top right, we just have a picture of, here's someone's yard, and you can clearly see in this rain event that there are drainage patterns in place. So starting to pay attention to that early on before you just decide to go install a rain garden is a really good idea. This one on the bottom right is an example here of them kind of taking advantage of the fact that there's a lot of impervious surface there that could drain into this kind of central area. They do have a drain, but it's an opportunity potentially for a good rain garden site. Okay, so we've gone out to the landscape, we have some ideas, we've kind of looked at potential areas. How do we dig in and kind of start determining what would be a good spot? Well, we kind of know that we want to ideally place our rain garden between a source of runoff, because again, we want to help capture those pollutants and help kind of hold and infiltrate that stormwater. So look for locations that could kind of be between that source of runoff and their ultimate destination, which could be a storm drain, could be a roadway, or whatever it may be. Think about the areas that are going to maybe best capture those sources of runoff. We'll cover this a little bit more, but a good rule of thumb too is that you want to think about distance from existing structures. So definitely want to keep about 10 feet downslope of existing building foundations, or downspouts is another way to think about it. But we'll cover that more during our kind of constraints section. But keeping in mind existing buildings and infrastructure is something good to be thinking about this stage also. Okay, so I mentioned downspouts. Well, these are downspouts. I think we've all seen them before, but keeping in mind where those are located, especially around your home, is helpful, because here, in this image, we can see, okay, we have two downspouts that's capturing that stormwater from the rooftop. And on the left there, we can see where that downspout is kind of putting that water back into the yard. The one on the right, maybe we're not exactly sure, but there's the potential maybe for those two downspouts to combine into a rain garden there in the front yard. So that could be one potential site. Something else to keep in mind with downspouts is that you can redirect their flow. You can use kind of simple piping mechanisms like we see here that can be rerouted if you want to redirect that water to your rain garden. So during your site investigation, you can also be thinking about pinch points or locations in the landscape there that are going to be naturally just kind of capturing a lot of that water flow whenever it rains. So that could be, sites between two structures or two parts of the rooftop, things like that. But just here, let me show you another example that kind of makes this point a little bit better. This was a site at a local school where we were thinking about installing a rain garden, and their topography just kind of naturally took the stormwater from the rooftop and had it draining into this kind of low location right before a outfall pipe here. So that's an example of a pinch point. And sometimes that can be helpful for making sure that that stormwater runoff is going to get to your rain garden. So when we're doing our site investigation, other things to be looking for are potential collection points. Sometimes there's kind of a residual effect of water moving across an environment. Sometimes that we know water has picked up sediment or sand, and that you might see kind of evidence of where that water has flowed by looking across your landscape. So kind of keeping that in mind, if it's not raining when you're out doing your investigation, that might help you get an idea of where the water typically flows. But you also want to be avoiding those areas with poorly drained soils. And I think this is probably counterintuitive to what a lot of people think when they think rain gardens, is that we're not necessarily selecting sites that are already soggy and wet. We are trying to intercept that stormwater runoff. And we want, I think like Naomi mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that those sites are going to drain and not, drain within a couple days and not breed mosquitoes. So drainage and understanding your soils is really important. And Caitlin will talk a little bit about that in a minute. Something else to keep in mind is if you live in a densely populated area, your neighbors, we don't want to make our neighbors mad by installing a rain garden that either is on their property or might overflow into their property. So that's something that we have to think about. And maybe they'll be interested in partnering with you on a rain garden, but don't make any enemies with your rain garden design. Long-term maintenance is also a big concern. And, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that if it's out of sight, sometimes it's out of mind. So think about the location of your rain garden as being important for maintenance too, because you want it to be visible enough that you will take care of it, see if there are any problems, and make sure that the vegetation is getting the care and treatment that it needs. This rain garden here is one that we have in the Arboretum here at Auburn, and it's placed in a very prominent spot and well-maintained. So giving rain gardens a good name. Also, we think about locations, parking lots can also be a potentially good spot. This is, I believe, at a high school, but sometimes there are vegetated areas that kind of capture that stormwater that's running off of parking lots, and that can be a good spot to look at as well. Even if there aren't particularly downspouts, there's still that urban runoff that could be infiltrated. So something to keep in mind, rain gardens, well, we've talked about their purpose, just so we want to make sure that your rain garden is going to get enough water, is going to be capturing some of that stormwater runoff. So we want to think about the inflow, but also the outflow. Like I said, we don't want that overflow to be directed anywhere it shouldn't be, into your neighbor's yard or anything like that. So be thinking about the before and after of that stormwater inflow. Okay, so evaluating your site. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but building foundations, we really don't want to compromise those. So always, make sure that your rain garden is at least 10 feet away from those foundations, because of course, water is going to seep back into the earth, and we don't want that to compromise those foundations in any way. You also want to be aware of septic systems, well heads, spring heads, things like that, because we don't want, again, we don't want to compromise our existing infrastructure. So be aware of those things on your property and just make sure that you kind of rule out those areas for your rain gardens, or just make sure that they're far enough away from those to not be a problem. This maybe doesn't have to be mentioned, but don't put your rain garden uphill. Again, we want to help capture that stormwater runoff. So hopefully it'll be located in an area that is downhill and capturing the runoff as it naturally flows. Okay, some other things to be keeping in mind here. Utilities, they are often hidden, and we do not want to cause a messy, expensive issue by digging without knowledge of our utilities. So make sure that if you're in Alabama, call Alabama 811, and they will ask you for GPS coordinates, and they will let you know if there are utilities there, and they will even come out and mark them so that you can make sure that you plan your rain garden in a location that's not going to be a utility hazard. Also make sure, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we want to avoid building a rain garden in a high water table. Again, we want the rain gardens to drain and infiltrate. We don't want it to necessarily sit. So making sure that we avoid those kind of already wet areas can be important. Okay, another thing to keep in mind is power lines. This may not be as much of an issue if you are not planting trees or shrubs, but just be aware that there's often maintenance that happens around power lines, and we don't want our rain gardens to be um, disrupted, shall we say, by maintenance. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so this is an example of a rain garden site that was happening at a local school, and it's hard to see here, but this there are two basically rain garden shapes, and the first shape that they drew extended much further out, and that was their first design. And then they called Alabama 811, and they came out and they marked a gas line, and basically they had to redesign their rain garden to make sure that they didn't approach that. So if they hadn't done that, it could have been a really bad situation. So just always make sure that you do that first. Something else to note here in terms of constraints is that, having to work with those utilities and the wall there on the left can make it a little bit of a tight fit. So they might have had to make their rain garden a little bit smaller to make sure that they give enough space between that retaining wall and that building edge and the rain garden design itself. So just be keeping in mind those constraints. Again, so avoid those. Do not place it on top of a septic system. Don't place it uphill. Avoid being too close to those foundations, and things like sidewalks and slabs are not as concerning. You can build your rain garden a little bit closer, but definitely building foundations. Don't build closer than 10 feet. And of course, don't build it in your neighbor's yard unless they love rain gardens too. And like Naomi said, maybe you can go out and explain why rain gardens are fantastic, and they might get on board. Okay, do not place on slopes steeper than 10%. Just think about that. Basically, we don't want that that stormwater going down a really steep slope that could basically make it really difficult for your rain garden to actually capture and infiltrate that water. If you have really steep slopes, you might want to reach out to a landscape contractor and think about kind of other mechanisms that you could put in place, like terracing or multiple kind of smaller rain gardens. But if you have a really steep slope, rain gardens may not be the best solution, and you might want to look for professional design help or engineering help with that. Oh, lastly, don't place your rain garden in a site if you're doing active construction. Like if you're building a new house or you're, moving into a new place, there's still construction going on, wait until that's over, because you don't want all that sediment or soil to be washed into your newly established rain garden and kind of clog up the rain garden and harm the plants. So basically, we want these green infrastructure practices to be installed. It's great to be thinking about them while you're building and while you're doing construction, but the actual installation should be towards the last stage. So just things to know. Okay. I'm going to, I guess, turn this over quickly to Caitlin to talk about how do we know if our soils are appropriate for a rain garden. And then I see that we have some chats, people commenting in the chats. We'll try to have some time for Q&A afterwards. All right, Caitlin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Hi, my name is Caitlin Sweeney. I've been working with the Extension Water Program, and just let me know if you can hear me, if I need to speak up.
Sounds good.
So assessing your soil is really important when you're building a rain garden. You really want to make sure that that soil is going to infiltrate properly. We know that, as Laura and Naomi have mentioned, it's going to overflow at some point, so it's going to fill up. But we just really want to make sure that we can have it drain within 2 to 3 days. So typically, sandy soils tend to drain faster than a clay soil, but there are other things we can look at too to help us, like soil color. Dry soil tends to have a lot more oxygen, which leads to higher rates of oxidation. So you end up with more brownish and reddish colors in your soil. But meanwhile, soil that's not draining very well, that's wet a lot, it tends to be gray or greenish due to reduced iron oxide. So you can really think of gray soil as kind of like a warning sign not to build your rain garden right there. It's probably not going to drain very well. We very much recommend doing an infiltration test. This is going to be very helpful and give you some numbers to actually look at recommendations. So this is just pretty much a 3-step test. It's pretty simple. Step 1 is just to dig a hole. We recommend 1 foot, but I know Laura mentioned shallow water tables earlier. And if you're very concerned about that, you can consider digging down to 2 feet. But as we said, you might want to call 811 before you dig too deep because you don't want to harm any of those utilities. Step 2 is just to fill the hole with water and see how long it takes it to drain. You want to repeat this step at least twice because the more times you repeat it, the more saturated your soil is going to get. And the more saturated it is, the more accurate it's going to be to show you how well your soil is going to handle a rainy season. It's also worth noting that these measurements can take a very long time if you do that 1 foot drainage. It can take several hours. So we've done tests before where we just dug the 1 foot hole, but instead saw how long it took to just drain 1 inch. But it's very important, again, to just make sure you have that saturation, or else if you're just measuring it right away, you're probably going to overestimate how well your soil can infiltrate. And step 3 is just to divide that drainage length by the amount of time it took. So here we have an example where we had 1 inch of drainage in 10 minutes. So we just take 1 inch, divide it by 10 minutes, and you have 0.1 inches per minute. And then if you multiply it with the 60 minutes in an hour, you have an infiltration rate of 6 minutes per hour. And with that infiltration rate, we can really help determine how suitable our location is. So from these measurements, you may find, yeah, your soil's adequate without amendments. It's going to work great for a rain garden. You might find that you need some amendments to have a nice rain garden. And you might find that your soil is just completely unsuitable to have a DIY rain garden. So if you see this table here, we've got our drainage rate on the left and our recommended practice on the right. So if your soil is draining over 1 inch an hour, a standard rain garden is probably going to fit really well in that soil. If you have 1/4 inch to about 1 inch, then you're probably going to want to consider amending your soil for better infiltration. And we're going to talk more about soil amendment later in our, I guess tomorrow when we get more specific with our design. And then if your soil is draining less than 1/4 inch per hour, you're probably going to need to adjust your plan. So if that happens, what if it is taking too long? Let's say you filled up your 1 foot hole and after 3 days it still hasn't drained. Probably shouldn't build a rain garden there. And an obvious thought you can have is just to look for another location in your yard and it might work. But there are also other things you could do. You could work with it and install a wetland. You could install a rain garden that has under drains to help it to help drain the soil faster. But when you start looking at these things, you're probably going to want to consult a professional first, which is why we say the others are better for a DIY rain garden. And this just takes takes a little more knowledge.
Right. It is possible, but yeah, it might take a little more expertise for sure.
And then we have our quiz, which
it's not a quiz. Yeah.
But you know, mosquitoes need standing water to reproduce and breed, and So it takes 4 days for a mosquito to go from an egg to an adult. And that's one of the reasons we say we really want a rain garden to drain in less than 3 days. You don't you don't want to accidentally turn your yard into a mosquito breeding ground. So that's why we really recommend doing the infiltration test, just to make sure you can have your soil drain within 3 days.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. So we're moving along at a pretty good clip. So I want to maybe pause here for a second and just address any questions that you all have. Let's see, I can look at the chat, but does anyone have any questions about what we've covered so far?
We had a question on if rain gardens can be part shade or not.
Yeah, that is good. That's a good question. And we'll talk more about that with vegetation tomorrow, about how to select plants for your rain garden. It certainly can be part shade, but it can be, it could be problematic if you aren't selecting plants that can do well in shade. And like I said, we'll cover basically how to find those native plants and kind of select plants that are going to be appropriate for the rain garden. I mean, we'll also talk about different planting depths. Some plants like to have their feet wet, quote unquote. They don't mind being wet. And then those deeper parts of the rain garden, others like to be higher. So the answer is yes, but we have to do a little planning. Let's see, what other questions do we have? I see someone said they want to attract pollinators and absorb water. Fantastic. Native plants definitely do that. They can be a great way to help kind of restore a little bit of that urban ecosystem that we tend to lose with, impervious surfaces and kind of just the fact that a lot of our urban habitat gets lost when we build, when we urbanize. So rain gardens can definitely do that. Any other questions that we have? Oh, let's see. Can we have a rain garden that merges from rain garden into a wetland? You could, yes. I think the difference there is just to keep in mind that it would be a little different than your standard rain garden. It could be a wet rain garden, but you would want to select different plants that are going to be able to survive with that standing water. A lot of plants can't do that. And you'll also have to keep in mind the potential mosquito or different kind of aquatic life that area might attract, which can be amazing and wonderful, but you just have to plan it a little differently. Okay, any other questions? All right, looks like not. And if you guys think of any as you go on. Oh, Beth said prairie soil. I don't know. What I would suggest you do, Beth, is do an infiltration test like Caitlin talked about. And you can also go get a soil test, but definitely do an infiltration test to see if those soils are draining or not, because that will play a big role in whether or not that's an appropriate spot for a rain garden. So definitely try that out first. Oh, sorry about that, Beth. Let's see, what if there's a flat area with a high water table? Help mitigate, let's see. We will talk about, Rachel, we'll talk about the depth of rain gardens. Maybe we'll get into that today, and how shallow you can build them. But let's see, if you live in a flat area with a high water table, it's problematic because, again, you do want those rain gardens to drain. I mean, there are ways to kind of design them so that there's less ponding or there's less rainwater being held there over a long period of time. I think it kind of depends a lot on your site, I guess I would have to say. So I would encourage you to do that infiltration test and then think carefully about, the depth of the rain garden and whether or not you need to maybe amend those soils. Okay. Okay, so I know, let's see, I'm just going to get into this a little bit today and we'll pause again for some questions and then dive in more tomorrow. So determining your drainage area, to kind of go along with Rachel's question, we've talked about rain gardens are hopefully going to treat that impervious surface runoff and help kind of capture or slow down that runoff and capture pollutants. So the size of the impervious surface, the runoff that you're capturing that rainwater from, the size of that area is also going to influence the size that your rain garden needs to be. So, you know, once you've kind of thought of a site and you understand basically, you've done your infiltration tests, you've called 811, you know, this is a good site. We want to kind of start thinking about, well, what size should our rain garden actually be? And this is how we do that. So this picture here on the right is a site that we may still install a rain garden at a local school. And we had selected a site, I showed you that pinch point earlier, where that water is flowing down slope into this kind of area that was would have been great for ponding, had a good infiltration site. It was right between that area of runoff and a pipe where that water was going to be redirected. So we then decided to map out which part of that rooftop was directing the stormwater to that area. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. So here on the right, I've kind of shaded in that area that we knew was all going to be draining to that potential rain garden site. So in your area, you're going to want to be thinking about those impervious surfaces, right? Any hard surface that's not allowing that water to infiltrate, it's causing runoff, whether that's your sidewalk, your driveway, those rooftops, slabs, any of that. Thinking about what impervious surfaces are going to contribute to that runoff. And then we want to try to understand the area. So there's a couple ways you can do that. In this previous example here, I used Google Earth. That's a free service, and you can use Google Earth essentially to estimate the square footage area of a site that you draw. So you can actually use a little pen tool and draw out the area of your rooftop or your parking lot that you know is going to drain, and it will automatically calculate your square footage, which is very helpful. And you know, generally we're going for an estimate. It doesn't have to be like 100% perfect, but we do want a general estimate, and this can be a really handy tool for making it easy on yourself to do that. But if you are not into that idea and want to just do it by hand, you can also do it the old-fashioned way and just go out and pace. So let's say that you have a house and you know that basically half of your rooftop is draining to a certain part in the yard that you want to kind of install a rain garden. You can go out and estimate what your pace is and measure via pace what that area might be. Of course, you can also use measuring tape, and of course this is on the ground, so you can estimate that way. But again, you know, I would encourage you to make sure that you're doing a site visit, being there on the ground, paying attention to which impervious surfaces are contributing to that runoff, and making sure that you're kind of measuring that. This picture on the top left here is just showing you again that all of that surface area from that rooftop that's shaded in, that's all being captured and rerouted into this storm or this drainage pipe that you could reroute if you wanted to a rain garden. But you have to know where those downspouts are to really understand how much square footage or how much surface area is going to contribute to your potential rain garden site. Okay. Let me see. I heard some people say they had some audio issues. Are you guys still able to hear me okay? Most people? Okay, I think most people can. If you can't, you know, just feel free to pause or say something, but hopefully this mic is picking up. Okay, so this is a little tool that we also have in our rain garden manual that you'll get, but this is just a little helpful way to maybe keep track of all those different impervious surfaces that could be, you know, contributing to your rain garden. So roof downspouts, driveways, sidewalks, et cetera, you can kind of estimate your square footage and area, put it here, and then total it up. And that will kind of help you come to that conclusion. So let's see. I don't think I'm going to go too far into this today because I know we're going to get into this a little bit more tomorrow, but you do want to make sure that you're calculating your rain garden size to be large enough to treat that surface area. So we can think about your rain garden needs to be a certain size to treat the combined surface area runoff. So the volume, is described in terms of the ponding depth, which I think Naomi and Caitlin mentioned, and you can see here, that's that basically the amount of depth from the very bottom of your rain garden to the overflow area. And you want to think about that in the square feet of surface area that you'll need to design your rain garden. So the more impervious area that you want to treat, essentially the bigger your rain garden needs to be. However, that's not a strict rule. You can also have a smaller rain garden because sometimes we have those site constraints, right? We can't just design a rain garden kind of the ideal sized. So it's not always as straightforward and it's not always as simple as that, but this can kind of give you we'll talk through, I think tomorrow, how to create that estimate of what your rain garden size should be or could be, and then think about how to adjust depth and size based on, soil, the area, square footage area that's contributing runoff, and the site constraints. So I think I'm going to pause it there and just let us dig into this a little bit more tomorrow with a more in-depth example. We will walk through some examples. We'll also do a little worksheet where you can kind of work through how to estimate these calculations on your own and for your own potential site in the future. So we'll dig into all that tomorrow and talk through examples. We'll also talk through different planting plans and how to do plant selection. Okay. So I will just leave this off for now and let anyone who has any questions feel free to ask them. And otherwise, we'll plan on seeing you all tomorrow. And again, if you can't make it tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we will record it and you'll get a link to that. Anyone who's registered will get a link to that and they can watch it whenever they want. Okay. All right. I know everyone's busy, so we're going to try to pack everything in as fast as possible, but make sure that everyone gets all the education they need. All right, guys, we will see you tomorrow. And I'll just hang on here for any questions that you guys have.
There's a couple in the comments. There's, should you consider the area of sloping ground from which water may flow in heavy rains?
So I think, does that mean, should you consider the area underneath the slope, maybe at the bottom of a slope? That could be an appropriate site. Again, I think you just want to make sure that the soils are going to be able to infiltrate that runoff. So when we said avoid those steep slopes, we're really talking about don't put your rain garden on a slope, but at the base of a slope could work just fine. It just depends upon the site and that soil infiltration.
They maybe meant it as including that area in part of your calculation.
Oh, I wouldn't include that as part of your, I guess it depends upon the site. It's kind of hard to answer that question without seeing. Let's see. Oh, so you mean, let's see, if there weren't any impervious surfaces and you were just thinking about like a natural area that was kind of capturing flow, if that's what I understand. I haven't thought about that before, but I think that could be maybe helpful in estimating the size of your rain garden. If you were kind of relying on that slope to capture that storm water and infiltrate or kind of redirect it to a low spot, that could be one way to do it. So Kathy, I would say if you are not designing for an area that's kind of capturing that water from impervious surface, maybe you could substitute a slope for kind of estimating that square footage area, just as a kind of guesstimate for a good rain garden site? Okay, it would be a roof area and a sloped area. Again, it's hard to say without seeing the site, but I would definitely include that the roof area that's capturing that runoff. So calculate that. And if that is running onto the sloped area, I wouldn't calculate it twice. But hopefully that kind of makes sense. Let's see. Rachel says, if you build a rain garden too small, what are the consequences? Will the plants be affected? It's a good question, Rachel. And we'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow too with the depth. So if you build it too small, essentially, if you've done it right, there will be that overflow section. So the rainwater can overflow and it won't necessarily be held there as long. It just basically means that there's less area for that water to be held and for it to infiltrate. Could it impact plants? Yes, it could in the very beginning when they're getting established. You know, sometimes when we have really itty bitty plants and there's a big rain event, there are times where those plants kind of can get washed out if there's a big influx of water. So that would be something to really pay attention to in the very beginning, making sure that those plants are getting their roots established and hopefully not getting washed out or, you know, having any sort of like sediment or mulch kind of harming them. But again, hopefully if it's been designed in the right way and there's that overflow, it shouldn't be a big problem. Let's see. Beth says a lot of the water is behind the slope in my house. Well, at the very base of a slope could be a good spot for a rain garden. Again, just don't try to build it into the slope because that can sometimes defeat the purpose of a rain garden. I think that was our main point with that. I will also say with the slope, if you're not thinking about only a rain garden, there are other ways that you can kind of slow that water from going down a slope. You can think about terracing. You could plant other plants that can kind of help maybe slow or filter that. So, you know, you can think about kind of combined landscape efforts to slow some of that runoff.
So that kind of ties in, I think, to a question. Someone said, can I build a few different retaining walls, creating several gardens stair-stepping down? So would you say like terracing would be a good?
I would say that is a thing that you can do. That's getting into the realm of kind of landscape architecture and engineering. And that's a little beyond any official advice I'm willing to give. I think it really depends upon the site, but I think that is a really good option. And you might want to talk with someone about that option. Again, landscape architects and engineers, because if it's a really steep slope, you get into things like retaining walls and, you know, you want to make sure that that's sound and not going to get washed out. But those terraces can be a really good way to do that. And if it's, you know, again, depending upon your site, if it's not incredibly steep, you can do some of that terracing yourself, or you could contact a landscape architect and see what their suggestions would be. Yeah, Rachel says terracing has helped her yard significantly. Rachel, did you go with a professional contractor to address that issue? Yes, okay. Yeah, very steep slope. Right, some people try to place straw or things like that, and that'll just often get washed away if there's not something else to help keep that in place. So terracing is a good option. Okay, so Hannah says, is a rain garden the same as a regular garden, but you're intentional about the placement? Good question. It's similar in some ways to a perennial garden in the sense that you are selecting native plants that are going to be low maintenance and hopefully come back year after year. Yes, you're being more intentional about your placement. You know, the goal ideally is to help kind of capture some of that stormwater runoff and help address pollutant loads that might be entering rivers and streams. So there's that intentionality, but there's also the fact that you are, it's slightly more engineered, I think, than your typical garden. I mean, we are going to talk about that tomorrow, but again, you're calculating the size of the runoff and you're calculating your rain garden based on that. So You are going to be digging down to a particular depth and maybe amending soils if need be, doing that soil test to make sure there's infiltration. So a little more intentional, a little more hyper designed, I would say. But in many ways, it can look like a typical aesthetic part of a landscape if done well. Okay, any other questions? All right, I don't think so. So otherwise, I guess we will see you guys tomorrow. All right, thanks everybody.